Hi, Linda.
Hey Josh, how are you?
I'm pretty good. How are you doing?
I'm fine.
All right, well, let me introduce us. I am Josh Summers. This is Meaning of Life TV, and you are Linda Blanchard. I'm going to describe you as an independent scholar of Buddhism. You have written an interesting book called Dependent Arising in Context, the central teaching of the Buddha drawn from the context of the society he lived in and explained in terms of modern life. And you also have a blog at your website, justalittledust.com. Is that the correct link? Yeah.
Yes,
So
it
we'll,
is.
we'll include that there. Um, so this is a book you've written about really like what is sometimes seen as the quintessential or central teaching of the Buddhas. And I came across your work a few years ago, I guess. I've been trying to be the imperfect Buddhist meditator that I am. And that inevitably I would come across teachers talking about the central teaching of dependent origination. And trying to be conscientious about that, I would look at the teaching and instantly almost go cross-eyed, because in the suttas, in the recording of these teachings, that particular teaching comes off extremely abstract, cryptic, and just hard to decipher. So anyway, I wasn't satisfied with the typical interpretations I was reading about, and got onto Google, like anybody might, and came across a series of blogs that you had written for the Secular Buddhism Association. And it seemed like you were laying out an argument or an interpretation that what the Buddha was really getting at in this core teaching is that there's a kind of psychological process at play that creates suffering. And once you understand that, you can stop creating that psychological stress or psychological problem and experience the cessation of suffering or dukkha. And that kind of confirmed my intuitions around what the Buddha was getting at. And I have to say, I didn't really pursue it much more after that. I think she has got a great take on this. I'll leave it at that. But as I keep digging around, I keep coming up with sort of more hard-line interpretations that this teaching is referring to something about birth or rebirth. It's getting into sort of a cosmological explanation of causality in the universe. And so I wanted to dig further, and ironically came back to this book. Someone else recommended this book, and I picked it up, and there's some more stuff in here that I want to unpack. I've been talking a lot, but before I pass it over to you for a second, for people that are listening, because I think there are a lot of kind of lay Buddhists out there, people who might be doing mindfulness practice, going on a few retreats every now and then, they may not be aware that this teaching is really kind of the bedrock teaching of the Buddha's insight about liberation and things. So I wanted to give a feel for it, and I pulled up just a translation of this sutta, translated by the American monk Thanissaro Bhikkhu, where he summarizes the whole teaching this way. He says, or he translates, the question is, what is codependent arising, or what is dependent co-arising? From ignorance as a requisite condition come fabrications. From fabrications as a requisite condition comes consciousness. From consciousness as a requisite condition comes name and form. From name and form as a requisite condition come the six sense media. From the six sense media as a requisite condition comes contact. From contact as a requisite condition comes feeling. From feeling as a requisite condition comes craving. From craving comes clinging and sustenance. From clinging sustenance as a requisite condition comes becoming. From becoming as a requisite condition comes birth, and then from birth as a requisite condition, then aging and death, sorrow, lamentation, pain, distress, and despair come into play. Such is the origination of the entire mass of stress and suffering. So it's a mouthful, and listeners hopefully might understand why I went cross-eyed when I would come across it, because it's like
At
loaded
least
with jargon.
it's clear saying what dependent arising is talking about. It's suffering.
Yeah.
I mean, that's the short answer.
Yeah, that's the nutshell version, that it's sometimes presented as it's just a detailed sort of anatomy of the genesis of suffering, right?
right.
But when you came across, or when you first started studying this, what was problematic in that, in the conventional interpretations in your eyes?
But just that all the pieces didn't make sense. Like you, I went out and read a lot of different people's takes on it to try to understand what it was. And, a lot of the interpretations are that it's absolutely linear, in which case you have consciousness arising before the body does in name and form, and feelings arising out of that, which makes that part makes sense. But then what the Buddha is saying, I mean, literally, he says you have to stop each of these links. But it doesn't make sense to stop consciousness. I can tell by the way he speaks after his enlightenment in so many suttas that he's conscious. So, there's something wrong with that.
So that interpretation, because I've heard that too, is that you're trying to interrupt these links. So there's an idea that if you can catch something that it's arising, whether it's consciousness or feeling, that the whole chain will be then interrupted and you won't arrive at the end destination of suffering. Right. But the interpretation is you have to stop all feeling, all contact. And I mean, how do you continue to live and stop all contact? So there were a lot of different questions there. And my first encounter with it was in What the Buddha Taught by Rahula Walpola. Mm-hmm. And he talks about dependent origination, and the only part that makes sense when most people go over it is the very central part. That seems to be very well understood. From the moment of contact, you react to the contact with feeling. Once you have the feeling, you sort of you continue along feelings, but you decide you like things or you don't like things. That little chain made sense, and it makes sense to pretty much everybody who looks at it. But it's so detailed, I couldn't quite figure out why we were doing so much detail. And then what came before it and what came after it isn't that kind of detailed. So they're apparently different things. Yep.
So
can I just pause you for 1 second, because that portion that you teased out, I think, is probably the most intelligible of the whole chain. And for people that aren't familiar with it, to hear these sort of simplified terms for the steps, it can still go by very quickly. But there's this chain where you have contact, and then feelings condition clinging. So as an example, maybe like your eye makes contact with a powdered an apple or a powdered donut, and that generates certain feelings, which then potentiate certain desires and intentions to grab it or to draw it near, right? Right.
Yes, and it is just super, super detailed. I kind of want to talk about the overall structure to say anything more about that part.
Right. So so that was the thing that it was in your book. That was kind of like the key that unlocked this other meaning, because oftentimes I think all the commentaries from like Buddhaghosa, who was he 5th century?
Somewhere around
there, 5th century AD, all the commentarial views on this really seem to be taking the language at face value,
right,
and then trying to make sense of it. Right. So you hear things about rebirth in the end of the teaching, and it seems like the Buddha is literally speaking about what conditions how you get reborn into your next life or something like that.
Certainly.
But in your book, you sort of dig back and you unearth the context within which this teaching was given, which then kind of changes the entire meaning around what the original teaching was. Very much like, the thought occurred to me, it's like a joke taken out of context will lose all humor power. Will not have any humorous effect if you don't understand the context of which it's being given.
That's right.
So, talk about the context that you unearthed around this teaching.
Well, it starts from me being sort of in the same place you were, where you were reading about dependent origination, dependent arising, whatever you want to call it, and there being so many different interpretations. And it's confusing. So you try going back to the suttas yourself and reading these things, and you get the feeling about what's going on. And that's pretty much where I started from, was I could tell that the 5 links were sort of givens, given that we come into the world in this particular state. And then everybody knows the middle section is super detailed. And I could tell that, we're basically saying what results from all of that at the end is dukkha, basically. And I think almost anybody who's reading that can recognize that sort of flow that's going on. But linking it to the language was really tough. So my question was, why does he use the language that he uses? I mean, to understand what's really going on, it's clear you had to have the context for the joke,
Right, and it does go. Where does it start? It starts with ignorance. So yeah, the whole chain of this connection or this process begins with this really clearly understood term. And I'm saying that jokingly, like ignorance. Right. Well, what is ignorance of what?
Right, and it gets defined in the suttas different ways, but the clearest one is that it's ignorance of the Four Noble Truths. It's ignorance of dukkha, the definition of dukkha, what dukkha is basically, ignorance of how that, I'll use the word suffering because everybody tends to use suffering. All right, everybody tends to use suffering as the definition for it. So it's saying, understanding suffering, understanding the cause of suffering, recognizing that suffering can end and that there's a path to the end of suffering. So it's saying, that you don't understand any of that, basically, is the ignorance he's talking about. He's not talking about book ignorance. He's talking about ignorance of this process that he's about to try to explain to you with the rest of the links. And that, makes a good introduction to his talk. This is what I'm going to explain to you is I'm going to give you knowledge that's going to cure this ignorance. So.
Right, and this will get into the kind of the argumentative or the polemical side of this teaching, in that defining ignorance in terms of not understanding the Four Noble Truths, like the processes that cause suffering, is a different, at least a different value of ignorance than, say, ignorance of the essential self that you might see in like a Vedantic form of spirituality, where you're trying to uncover the true self, and that's what's going to bring you to freedom.
And that's what he's doing from the very get-go in there. He's saying, you guys are all about knowledge, and it is about knowledge itself that was sort of in the air around them at that time. But I'm talking about a different thing. From the beginning, he defines what he's about to talk about as something different. But then he's using the same terms, basically the same set of structure, the same structure that they use to describe how what the self is. So it's the first 5 links match up to the Prajapati myth, which is you could call him the Lord of Creation, because he created the world and all of the things in it. It's a very, very old myth, and kind of starts with the cosmic egg is out there, and the language they use to describe the beginning situation is it was neither existence nor non-existence, and that matches up well to where humans start from. You're in the womb, and you really don't even know what's going on. You don't know who you are, where you begin and something else ends. You've got no clue. So, and that's ignorance also. So it matches up to ignorance.
So just to pause for a second, the structure, basically what you're saying is the structure that the Buddha used to describe this chain is echoing or running in parallel to a structure of explanation from this creation myth known as the Prajapati myth. Right. So the same terms, the same key sort of milestones in the development of something get used. Right.
The same story is just being touched upon by each of the terms. And the myth also is paralleling human creation. So you have this nothingness. Well, it's not nothing. They've said it's neither existence nor non-existence. It's not nothing. It isn't, something. It isn't anything. We just don't know what it is.
It's a nothingness.
hard to, you can understand we're still having trouble 2,000 years later trying to describe what that first step is in the Vedic worldview. But the next thing that happens is there's desire for existence, basically. No physical form at all, just desire. And paralleling that to human procreation, obviously human life starts with desire also between mom and dad. And then the desire is so strong, it finally births an awareness, a consciousness. The only problem with that consciousness is that that mind can't, like the baby in the womb, can't sort out what's mom and what's itself. The whole world is one, basically. There's no division. There's no senses to be able to tell what's going on. It's just a sort of really hungry for knowledge about itself. And in order to get the answer to its question, who am I and what the heck is going on here, it shatters itself into a bazillion little pieces. And each individual piece gets its own shape and gets its own name, and it also gains the senses. The next thing that happens is it gains the senses in order to try to figure out who it is. The only problem in that myth is all of the pieces don't know that they're all part of something that was one at one time, and the idea is that our job in life is to come to that knowledge that each of us has inside us, a slice of that bigger all.
So some people may be familiar with the idea, like the Brahmanical or the Vedic idea, that of the Atman Brahman unity, where in the center of us there's this sort of indivisible element that is the same as the creation of, or the same element of the universe at large, or something like that. And that this myth is sort of spacing that out in a way where the purpose of life is just to sort of recreate that essential identity, or reconnect with that essential identity, and thereby liberating yourself from sorrow and pain and all the other things.
Or life,
life in general.
Yes, yeah. So that, when you die, you go to union with Brahma, basically. There were many different worldviews at that point in time as to, so he's using a sort of a generic story and not really talking about the specifics of it too much. He's just sort of setting up the shape of it so that anybody who's anybody sort of knows the myth. Just sort of like we all know the Christian myths, for example, It didn't have to necessarily be only believers of that myth he was addressing or who would understand it, but it was just in the common pool of knowledge at that point in time. So, I had understood that first section, those 5 were the givens. This is how we come into the world. And so he's using a myth about how we come into the world and what the self is to describe something slightly different. And he's already told us that it's something different by his definition of ignorance.
Yeah.
So you have the first 5 steps, sankhara being that desire for existence, and it's sort of a driving force. It is what drives everything else that happens.
Sankhara is the second step in this chain, right?
Yes.
And
yes.
This is one that I know you wrote a whole chapter about it in your book. But it's actually a very refreshing treatment of that term, because normal translations that I've encountered are describing sankhara as volitional formations, fabrications. Any others that come to mind for you? Those are the two big ones.
It's a tough one.
Yeah,
it really is.
But it just seems like it's totally decontextualized from actual experience, the way it's described.
Right.
But when you describe it as drives, like that, just you feel a drive for something, and that conditions the way you do things.
Right.
That sort of unlocks it a bit.
Yes, and it is something you can actually see in your life. The whole shape of dependent arising is a lesson to give you the information you need to stop dukkha, and each step is telling you what to look at to see what he's trying to point out is going on in your own life. And so, one of the first things he suggests there is, look at what drives you, basically.
Mm-hmm.
And he's saying if you relate it back to the Prajapati myth, he's saying it's a desire for existence that is what's driving us. And on the secular Buddhist side, I think I managed to translate that to survival instinct, basically. We have this need for self-preservation. Animals have it too, but we humans are so complex that we have to ask the question, what is the self that I'm trying to preserve? And we get all involved in that. And ultimately, that's what he's saying is the problem is the fact that we have to overcomplicate the situation and come up with theories as to what's going on. But he doesn't get to that part yet,
Yeah.
At first, he's just saying the drive is there.
The drive is there. And in the Prajapati myth, the myth that he's essentially arguing against, is the standard or the general arc of that story that the Atman is created, gets created through the myth, and then it's sort of slowly perfected over the process of those links, right, to the point that it releases into eternal bliss at the end. Yes. The end point, yes, is eternal bliss.
Or even if you're, going to another life or, whatever. But yeah, you might go through a million lives before you get to the bliss.
Could be a million lives, not give or take, right?
Give or take a few.
But the Buddha seems to, like in your interpretation of this, it seems to invert this whole trajectory.
Right.
So how does he flip it?
One.
Yeah.
The other thing I need to point out is that sankhara, that word, actually now in Hindi means rituals. So he's also, basically saying, I'm going to talk about rituals at the same time he's talking about it being a drive. And so just to do the shape of the whole thing, the first part is how we come into the world with this drive to exist. And the only way we can know we exist is, to satisfy that drive is to know that we exist. So it's knowledge we're seeking. And then the middle portion that everybody understood in terms of this is this life and this is what we're doing that's the problem, is normally the words are associated with rituals. And I came to understand this through Joanna Jurowicz's Polish Vedic scholars' work. She describes the Prajapati myth. I didn't come up with it myself. I latched onto it through her. Normally, if you were describing these three parts, how we come into the world, the rituals are the things that the Vedic people would do to perfect that person, that self. And then, the last portion is, and then what happens, basically, if you do it right. And so there's also, in my understanding of Vedic ritual, there's also sort of a maintenance or a perpetuation of the world. Like the rituals were being done, right, to maintain a kind of cosmic order of things. Yes, and while mostly he's following the myth and using the terms and definitions from the myth, or from the whole cycle, I guess you would say. But at three places in there, he does something different, and that's where he flips it. He does it with ignorance. And then he does it in the middle section by using names that relate to the ritual, but making the definition be something entirely different. But he's describing rituals, but he's describing the rituals of how we think and, what we do, what our behavior is. And largely, he mentions common views in the day, rites and rituals and views of the self. So he's talking not just about the individual having this problem, but really society having this problem. And he is talking about how we create the world. It's the world we're creating in our heads, but he's paralleling it exactly all the way through.
So if the Buddha's not talking about kind of rituals that are kind of cosmologically oriented, like trying to maintain or propitiate to some non-observant God, or if he's not talking about that kind of ritual, give me a better feel for what kind of ritual he's pointing to in the way that we perpetuate something.
Well, it's habits of thought, really, and when he breaks it down into the tiniest of pieces. And it now makes sense to me that he do that because that can convey across time very well. We're still doing these exact things. We have that experience of contact with something outside of us, or an idea is also counted. We sort it into good, bad, or indifferent. We react to it. And from reacting to it, we then develop theories about it, basically. And then the theories get fleshed out and they become sort of a dogma. And all of this is us creating a sense of self, basically creating ourselves by the way we think about things. And it is in conjunction with the world. Our parents, it starts with, are, telling us what the world is made of and whether people are good or bad, or, giving us a worldview. And then our experiences play into it once we go out on our own. And so he's pointing out that whole development of
in some ways, it sounds like you're describing the process of identifying with narratives and views and opinions, and sort of from that weaving a tapestry of the self.
It is, and we sort of skip the end of the first 5 links. There's consciousness, and then when you divide, when Prajapati explodes and divides himself into all of the myriad pieces, they take on a form, they get a name. And that is part of the problem. He's defining it as part of the problem, basically, that and this is where dependent arising gets its reputation as being about non-duality and oneness. We've divided the world into subject and object, and us versus them on a larger scheme. So
the link you're talking about is the Pali is, if I'm correct, is Namarupa.
Namarupa,
which means name and form, or mentality and materiality. Sometimes
right.
It's just a subject-object duality. Is that the basic sense of that phrase?
Yes, and it gets defined very literally. So I mean, it's understandable how people didn't get what was going on for sure in this. Everybody's sort of muddied about it because he names the pieces and then he defines them pretty much in terms of the myth, and is fairly literal with it. He does it with consciousness as being, the mind that takes in objects of the senses, and birth and death. His definitions of things are very, very literal. He leaves out what's actually happening, mm-hmm. And that's kind of provided by the cultural knowledge of the Prajapati myth. And what you do with the Prajapati myth in this world is you create the self. And those rituals, the other thing is that I find fascinating, is that the rituals tend to be fire-based. They're based around fire, and the fire was associated with Atman. So this explains why he's got so many talks that he does, that he uses fire as basically the self. He talks right. about how we feed the fire, how we fuel the fire, and in the Vedic worldview, the fire is hungry, just like consciousness is hungry. It looks for its fuel. So,
hang on there for a sec. I mean, because fire does show up a lot in the Buddhist sort of metaphor for his teaching. He talks about the self as being on fire. Like
right.
The senses are on fire with contact. The eyes are on fire. The ears are on fire. The mind's on fire. He also uses fire as an analogy for what happens when you end suffering. When you right. experience nibbana, or the end of suffering, it's like a fire gone out, or a flame gone out. Right. But you just used the phrase that fire. The Vedic folks had the idea of fire as the Atman.
Right.
What is
right.
that? What is that? Can you unpack that a little bit for me?
Well, in the rituals that they're doing, they build a fire. They do all kinds of things. They put a post up that's the measure of the person who's paying for the ritual. This is all about him, They tie a goat to it. Now the post is him, the goat is him. They sacrifice the goat in the fire. The fire is him, and
him being
the sacrificer.
The sacrificer. Okay.
Yeah, the person who's paying for it. He's not the Brahmin priest. The Brahmin priests are doing all of the stuff, but this guy is basically paying for this ritual. And it's something, you do big rituals at certain points out throughout life, which is why Sankara nowadays is associated with big moments in a baby's life, cutting his hair and, that sort of thing, getting his first tooth. All significant moments. But you also do daily rituals with fire in their time. And each one is seen as helping to perfect the self and sort of making that connection between us and the cosmological order. And it's part of what feeds the universe to keep it ticking over in the correct way.
But did they see the Vedic folks see something as essential in fire that they were able to equate it with the Atman, or were they reifying the process of fire? I mean,
yes, reifying is exactly the word, because basically, when you snuff out a fire in the Vedic worldview, the fire doesn't die; it isn't extinguished. It's just no longer manifesting in this world. It still exists. It's just not manifesting in this world. And everything has an essential nature. That goes back to the Prajapati myth, of course. Every rock, every tree, every little thing has an essential nature. And it's fixed, and the relationships between things tend to be fixed. And that's part of what the Buddha is denying with this, is that there's anything that is essential inside of us. He's trying to show us how we create the things that we think are essential inside of us, so that we can, for one thing, recognize the non-dual nature of the world, that we are always in contact with the world. So there is no moment of contact, because we're always in contact with the world. And also, though, denying the fixedness of relationships between things.
Well, in what you just said, too, I think if you see the creation of how these things come to be, seeing the process of their creation negates their essential entity-ness, or their, their essentialness, or eternalness.
Right. Yeah, it shows you it's a process. It's not something that already existed. In the day, the self was perceived as eternal, separate, changeless, and something that had mastery in your life. And his very, very second, I think it's his second talk, he talks about how if we thought the body was the self, does it really have mastery over your life? Can it just say, I'm not going to have this cold anymore, and snap, right. You don't have a cold? No. So obviously the body is not the controlling factor. He goes through all of the different ways you can look at self and say, none of those are the self. He never says there is no self. He just points out all of the different ways people in his time thought of the self and asks them to look at it closely. And that's really what meditation and mindfulness are about, is looking closely, right, to be able to see that rising appearance of a thought, the rising of it and how it takes over for a while and then how it fades away. As an example.
So if you were to summarize the whole arc of dependent arising in this light, would you say that he's describing the way a particular sense of self comes into form, it comes to be, and then how that particular sense of self essentially creates problems for itself?
Where it leads, yes. And in the overall arc that he's answering, the natural thing would be, you come into the world because that's the way the world works, because of Prajapati's doings at the beginning. You do your rituals over and over and over again in your life to try to perfect yourself. When you finally get to that transition, you go through the funeral pyre. To me, that's bhava, that gets translated as existence or becoming. It's a transitory phase. And then you're born into whatever world. And he actually kind of defines what's going on there as you're born into the world of form, the formless world, the world of senses. He doesn't pick one. He says, the three major ways of looking at life are the things that you're born into. And normally the answer would be, and then you go to bliss, whether it's, the dualistic view that was the oldest view, sort of like ours. You live this life, you go to heaven, and that's it. Or whether you do cyclic lives, or whether you do union with Brahma, the three basic, ways that people were kind of looking at the world in those days. But he says, the outcome isn't bliss. The outcome is you live a life, you suffer, basically, and you're always going to be attached to, if we keep repeating this pattern daily in our lives with ignorant of the fact that we're doing this, ignorance has to be there at the beginning, then it's going to lead to us attaching ourselves to this life, and it ends up hurting us. That's basically, sickness, aging, and death, that last portion. He's describing what to look at in your life. Again, it's a sort of meditative field. Look at what happens when you're sick, or when people you love are sick, and what happens when people you love die, and the aging, and try to see the dukkha, see where it comes from. And that's where most of us start. It's actually where the Buddha started. His question was, why do we suffer, and how do we stop this? And when he sat under the Bodhi tree and worked on it, dependent arising is the lesson he awakened to, basically. Says it several times in the suttas. But he starts at the end, and that's where we all start. What's what brings most of us to Buddhism is, something's wrong in my life. I need to figure out what's wrong in my life. So let me, see if this is the answer.
I often warn people when they go to meditation centers, I said, don't be surprised if people don't look so happy. Because
right.
people show up on these shores because things aren't going so smoothly in their life, or the normal compensations aren't sufficient any longer.
That's what Gil Frunstall says about meditation retreats. Buddhists say that life is suffering, and we go to these 1 week meditation retreats to prove it.
Right. So, but he's really, it seems like he's describing a particular, almost like a psychological neurotic pattern of how our own minds generate suffering. It's not that everything that self does, or every aspect of the self, is problematic. It's only particular, I think you even use the phrase over the top energies or over the top dynamics where the self is just adding too much.
That's it. And I mean, so I mentioned that, you're creating the self, and it has a desire for existence, and it comes from self-preservation. That's what, keeps us here. That's why we're successful as a species, is because of that drive for self-preservation. But we humans complicate things. So we have to know what that self is, basically. We're asking that question just constantly. And the thing is that there's nothing wrong with self-preservation. I mean, you need it. To be a responsible adult in society, you have to take care of yourself, So the Buddha's not saying that all self-preservation is wrong, but he is saying that we tend to go a little too far with it, and that's the problem. And he's describing, what it is we're doing that makes that happen. And that's the thing about, where we started from, is trying to figure out how you want to break this chain by making consciousness stop, or feelings stop completely. Contact with the world. How do you go on living if you don't have contact with the world anymore? And so that sort of interpretation of it as literal, both the stopping completely being literal, and each one of those links being a literal description of every aspect of feeling and every contact you make, and every time consciousness arises, it's clearly something's wrong with that, basically. And so the thing is, he's not describing every moment of experience. A lot of people say the Buddha said life is suffering.
Right.
He never said life is suffering. He never does. That's the way people interpret it, is it's all samsara, and even good stuff is bad stuff. But he's actually saying, no, I'm narrowly defining, what the problem is, as starting with ignorance and ending with dukkha. And it isn't necessarily every single experience that we have that is a problem, just like it's not every aspect of self-preservation that's a problem. You have to have some of it. it's not every feeling, it's not every instance of consciousness, it's not every contact with the world. He's describing a very specific set of events that happen for us to look for, basically, so that we can see what's happening. And just in the process of seeing what's happening, if you start from dukkha, you say, why am I suffering? And you work your way back through this chain, and you do that over and over and over again, you're eventually going to see the patterns in your life. And you don't even have to make a conscious choice to quit behaving that way. You get so disgusted with doing that and having that outcome be the same that your behavior just changes all by itself, really. And he says that you don't have to set intentions to change or be a better person. It's possible to just follow this path.
Yeah.
And
no, I mean, I'm thinking about, I think it was Ajahn Chah, the Thai forest teacher, who said something about if you're holding on to a snake, you don't have to make conscious intentions to let go of the snake.
That's it. That's it.
If you fully, if you do understand that that's what's going on in your process, that there is a kind of more spontaneous change of behavior or spontaneous change of orientation within that dynamic.
And it is wonderful that it happens so naturally.
So one of the questions I had was around how does this interpretation of this core teaching kind of change, and I think maybe you've already spoken about it a little bit, but change the idea about what dukkha or suffering is in the Buddhist sense, the Buddhist definition of it, and what it means to come to the end of that, which is one way of describing sort of the goal of the holy life or goal of the meditative path is to realize nibbana. When you were talking about the kind of traditional interpretation of the chain, you're talking about stopping contact, stopping feeling. And that's how I've often heard nibbana described, is that it's this kind of transcendent non-experience, or out of this normal, out of the ordinary transcendent experience where there is nothing that you're experiencing, but just having that sort of blackout experience has a way of kind of repatterning your brain and changing the way you
total equanimity.
But coming out of it, you feel
you're
like
not attached to anything.
Exactly.
Total detachment.
I mean, you're kind of like a conscious vegetable of some sort.
Yes, and you hear that a lot. That's the goal of Buddhism, particularly from our critics.
Right, but within this model that you're presenting, or this interpretation, dukkha is like getting over dukkha doesn't mean that you will not experience pain, right? Right. And I think you posted a blog today on your website where you define dukkha as anything you feel that is unnecessary to feel, that you'd rather not feel, and that is in your power to change. Right.
And once again, it's that narrow definition.
Right.
So it's part and parcel with the, it's not all instances of consciousness or feeling. It's not all life is suffering. There are good moments that aren't involved with selfishness in the self, basically. I think all of it comes down to even, because he kind of talks about the internal and the external, so there's lust, there's greed, there's all of the things outside of you that you might cling to. And that's what we usually hear in beginning talks on Buddhism.
Desire for external objects. External things outside of you, right. That's what's meant by external. Then
there's the internal version, and there he's kind of talking about self. And you kind of put power and, glory and fame in those sorts of things. But I think even the external things comes back to the self. You want for yourself, you want pleasure, you want comfort, you want security, you want, it's fine to want those things, but wanting more than your share is not quite right. But so when you get to dukkha, yes, people have a tendency to say you're free of all suffering, and obviously the only way that happens is you die, and you have to be liberated first, and then you die, and then you're not going to keep going through the cycle of rebirth anymore. And that's a fairly literal, I can see why that would be a fairly literal interpretation of the not just the names of all of the 12 steps, but some of the definitions as well. But he's not defining the whole world in there. He's defining a particular problem. And causation is a big part of it. A lot of the suttas on dependent arising start with a talk about nutriment, is the word they use. And he's talking about, all beings need to eat. We all have to eat in order to stay alive. And so he's saying, here's the pattern. There's these founding conditions, and you have to keep doing these things, you have to keep eating in order to stay alive. So he's sort of set up, this is, a cycle of the pattern of we want to live, we have to eat. So he's talking about feeding the self.
Literally feeding like the sense of self that is problematic.
Right, with our opinions and that sort of thing. He then basically, he's given you a pattern to sort of apply to the whole thing. And so, you have this driving force and it's hungry for knowledge. Well, there's that relationship of having to be fed. The self has to be fed. The self is constantly trying to use its senses to find out more about itself, or to find out whether itself is right. So this is where cognitive bias comes in. You have a political leaning, you lean to the left, and you go out in the world and somebody who's on the right starts talking, and you're like, aversion to that, This guy is just an idiot, obviously, and so you discount his opinion because it doesn't fit with your opinion. And that's all about self and self-identity. And so he's kind of pointing out that that's the problem. So if you see the whole cycle as being about rebirth, what he could be saying is that the only way to get out of dukkha is to stop consciousness completely, stop feeling, stop contact by dying after you're awakened. But he also talks about the fact that all he teaches is suffering and the end of suffering, dukkha and the end of dukkha. He's not teaching anything else, and he is teaching it because he has experienced it. And yet he has backaches, he has days when he gets a little grumpy. You actually see him in the suttas living the same life that you and I lead. So he's clearly not talking about physical pain. Mm-hmm. He's talking about psychological pain, really.
Well, even in the, I was reflecting on this too recently, that in some accounts of his life, the personification of demonic forces known as Mara.
Mara, yes.
And so Mara is sort of the Buddhist devil that sort of tempts the Buddha to leave his seat the night he's trying to attain enlightenment. But throughout the rest of his life, aren't there accounts of Mara continuing to visit him?
Yes.
So, yes, in one way, like the same kind of triggering neurotic patterns of mind don't get eliminated with this kind of awakening that the Buddha is talking about. Right?
Yes. And Mara is actually the word for death. And so, the bad guy in the suttas, the devil in the suttas is, I would say, fear of death. It seems fairly clear that what's going on there is basically going back to a fear of death. And it does occur to him. When his father dies, I think Mara comes and visits him. Mm-hmm. There are other times where the good god Brahma comes to visit him too, but that's sort of a different story. But they're all parables. They're all myths that he's sort of creating himself in order to point to something else. It's each one of those dependent arising as looking like rebirth is a finger pointing at the moon. And the Mara stories are fingers pointing at the moon. They're not the moon itself. You're not supposed to take stuff literally. Mm-hmm. You're supposed to be looking at what's behind it, basically, and trying to see it in your own life. That's the key. That's the thing that makes you change is, everything he says it in very cryptic ways. They are more cryptic to us than they were to the people at the time because we've lost that context. But even to the people at the time, you can see misunderstandings going on. So it's still confusing even then. But the point is, he's telling you something that you can see in your life, and to always look at what he says and say, can I see it in my life? And if you can't understand you can't see what he's saying the way you've understood it, it's not necessarily that he's wrong. It might just be that you haven't really understood what he's saying. Mm-hmm. So in the overall problem with dependent arising and the whole question that tends to start off this questioning we do, he talks about the fact that you can't find an eternal, changeless, separate self. But there's this rebirth. He talks about rebirth constantly. How do you have cyclic rebirth? How do you have a next life if there is no you to begin with now that's visible? How can that possibly be? There's this contradiction that's just built into the whole thing. And my take on that is that he does this purposely. The point is to ask that question. What is he saying? These two things are in contradiction. So, am I supposed to take this literally, or is he saying something else?
Well, he does bring up the issue, like the link of birth in the cycle. Yes. What is it a birth of there?
You talking about on the Vedic?
No. In the Buddhist, in your interpretation of what the Buddha was getting at.
Well, I guess I have to answer both anyway. I mean, he talks about birth into the order of beings and birth into certain worlds, depending on which sutta you're looking at. So he is talking about birth into the world. And if you start from, if you look at the fact that he's talking about how we form opinions and how that leads to dukkha, what is the connecting factor between how our opinions go and how we always end up in trouble? And it's the way the world sees us. It's the moment we come out into the world. Our opinions and our sense of self have formed up to dogmatic levels, and we behave in certain ways based on those opinions. Mm-hmm. That's how we become visible to the world. And at the same time, he's talking about the fact that we tend to build up our worldview. We are born into the world we thought we were creating with our rituals. That's what the Vedic people were hoping for, that they would be born into the world. They're helping to create with their rituals. And that's what we actually do with our bad habits of thought, is we develop a worldview, and with cognitive bias, we are absolutely certain that we are born into, the world really is the way I think it is.
Right.
Obviously. And we're going to block out anything that contradicts that.
Was he then very prescient about the kind of election we just went through?
Well, say that again.
Was the Buddha just being, a prognosticator about the kind of election we just went through?
Yeah, that's a vivid example in real life, isn't it? Of how it's a cycle. It is a cycle, but it's sort of outside of time. These things happen on small scales. They happen on medium scales. They happen on very large scales. I have a tendency to think now of nations as having a created self that they will defend, and political views, sort of the meme theory, and the team theory, where information is starting to use us to propagate itself. And it's the same mechanism. There are defense mechanisms. There's attraction and aversion and defense mechanisms that you use to perpetuate yourself. And it all leads to the same place he's saying it leads. It all leads to us quarreling and fighting and arguing with each other. And he says, sticks and stones, basically. We end up going to war over these things.
I know we are close to our hour, and I wanted to, I guess, kind of conclude with asking you a question or two about kind of the pragmatic, practical takeaways of this teaching for, say, someone who might be meditating or trying to apply this into their practice. You mentioned mindfulness, and typically mindfulness is done where you might focus on the breath. Your mind wanders, you come back to the breath, or some variant of that. Would you have any kind of meditation instruction or recommendations based on trying to apply this teaching to someone's practice?
The overview a lot of times is, that the goal is to be just in the moment and, eat chocolate very, very well. For example, that's one of the exercises.
Not to correct you there, but I think it's a raisin.
Oh, well, yes, I've seen both.
To eat the raisin with undivided wholehearted attention.
Yes, and we have a tendency to stop there and think that's the whole point of the lesson, but
Right.
I don't think so. I think we're developing the skills to be able to pay attention to our lives, and you use dependent arising the same way the Buddha discovered it. Basically, you start from a moment in your life where something has gone wrong, and you recognize the pain that you're in. And the first thing you have to ask yourself is this the dukkha that he's talking about? Is it necessary or unnecessary pain you're feeling? If it's grief over somebody you love, that's necessary pain. But then what do we tend to do with grief over somebody we love? Sometimes we go get drunk, we take drugs, we go out and gamble, we try to run away from that experience, and that is unnecessary.
Can you just say, how is the grief necessary?
Well, I don't know. It's human psychology. The psychologists all tell us, and I think people, if they pay attention to their lives, will find in their own experience that it's only... My local teacher, Dennis Stratton, asks, what do feelings want? What is it that feelings have as their goal in life? And it's only to be felt. Mm-hmm. You have these emotions and things coming up. They're trying to tell you something, usually. And if you continue to deny them, they're just going to stay there and cause you trouble in your life. If you let them be felt and be experienced, then they're satisfied, basically. That need to exist is satisfied by, the knowledge that you said, yes, I see you feeling, It's hard to go through grief over,
No, I'm not saying you should, I'm not saying it's not necessary. It's just that I think there is this kind of pop view that if you're an accomplished meditator, then you won't experience the loss of your child in the same way that you would if you were untrained or something.
Well, in some sense, I think that's true. But what it is that there are two different things that happen. There's the necessary sitting with the feelings and facing the feelings and accepting the feelings. But in normal life, we have a tendency to do stuff with that that is not healthy and that is not necessary. And it's so asking yourself the question, is this dukkha or is this not, is key, because you have to look at what you can actually relieve and get away from and break the pattern of. I think if you are very good at meditation and mindfulness and practice, once you've developed it, you do experience things like that differently. You experience them dead on, though. What happens is you actually feel them, you live in them, you let yourself be there. It's not that you're dwelling in it and trying to draw it out. You're taking the moment just exactly as it is and feeling the pain, and then letting it move on. And that's related to Nirodha. You might want to look up the post I did on the secular Buddhist blog on Nirodha, because that's also used as nirvana. It's the word for cessation of feeling, cessation of dukkha.
Yeah.
It doesn't mean what people think it means. It means, I believe, actually experiencing the things we experience instead of trying to cling to them or be averse to them, instead of letting ourselves get away with pushing things away or pulling things to us and trying to keep them. We're letting ourselves experience the fact that, this is a moment in life. If it's a good moment, it's not going to last, so enjoy it,
Uh-huh. Yeah, with the word Nirodha, it is translated as cessation. It kind of sometimes implies that if things cease, they kind of vaporize or they go up in smoke, or there's just...
Right, it's the end, the very, very, very end.
Yeah.
But
right.
I think what he's actually talking about, and his life is evidence of it, is that you experience these moments of things happening over and over and over, and you see them end. If you work on this practice, you will experience, pleasure and pain, and you will see the arising of the desire to cling to that, or to watch the process of how you develop opinions about it and how you defend those opinions. That's what the mindfulness really is for being able to pay that kind of keen attention to your life. You'll actually see that sort of process happening. And
But the process you're describing, the reflective process, maybe call it a mindfulness process, that sounds more like contemplative in the sense that you're actively thinking through in an engaged way through something, which is not what we're not often taught is how mindfulness operates.
right, well, you're supposed to get to the point where you don't think at all, right?
Right. Stop your thoughts.
Yeah, I think stopping thoughts is key to not being so overwhelmed by them that you can't see what's going on. But I don't think what's going on. I don't think what the Buddha is aiming for is to never have a logical, rational thought again. You have to communicate with others if nothing else. So you're clearly going to be, thinking basically. But there is, in my own experience, there really is a part of me that's wiser than the rational self. And if I can slow down the storytelling and just sit quietly, a lot of times, the solution does come to me. So I can see where the idea of never having another thought in your head and just reacting in the moment and letting that piece of you that seems wise take over comes from. But I don't think, totally eradicating thought is the point.
Okay.
Just getting good enough,
Right. It seems, it sounds like there's this a sensibility towards your inner experience that's developed. Does that sound accurate to what you're describing with the meditation?
Yes. Yeah.
I have one more question for if you have time. Do you have time for one more?
Sure.
In this, coming back to the central teaching here, the 12 links of dependent arising, the first link, the thing that gets the whole boulder rolling, is ignorance.
Right.
So, in a sense, does the meditative or the reflective process you're describing seek to bring a kind of awareness to the fact that you're ignorant? Do you become aware that you're ignorant, and is that an antidote to the ignorance itself, or is there a specific kind of knowledge that starts to germinate that sort of attenuates the whole chain?
Ignorance, for me, ignorance as a field of meditation can actually be taken fairly literally as seeing how ignorance breeds ignorance, basically. That, your set opinions and that sort of thing feed into you continuing to have those opinions. That we think we know why people do things.
I mean, you're describing like getting into your own echo chamber.
Yes, but we're actually ignorant of what they are, and learning to recognize that is part of what's being described in dependent arising. So I think ignorance is a negative state, so it's a lack of something, so it's a little hard to meditate on it. I can't really call it a field for meditation, the way I do all of the rest of the links of being things you're supposed to look at, basically.
I mean, to me, I get the image of like a light bulb out, and I'm wondering what the experience of having the light bulb on is within this context.
I think it's a blinking light.
Well, that actually speaks to another part of my an earlier question I was coming to, which is that the experience of dukkha doesn't necessarily, you're not a one and done situation where like you maybe transcend it or overcome it and you never experience it again.
And there's clinging attached to that idea of that's what it is. I'm working for this goal, and this goal is I'm going to have that moment of awakening, and then I'm done. I can rest from then on. Isn't that a nice story? How much do we want that to be true?
It's pretty seductive.
It is. So it's an example in itself of the process really that he's describing in Dependent Arising, that, we're looking for comfort for the self and for something good. And I can understand, how that can motivate practice, but it also tends to lead you down a path where you get frustrated because, you thought you saw instances of it, and then you had that moment of satori, and you think you're fine from here on, and damn,
Yeah, back in the dukkha patch.
Yes.
Back in the dukkha.
Go back to doing the damn laundry.
Yeah. Well, listen, Linda, I want to thank you very much for your time. If people want to find you, what's the best way for them to seek you out?
They can talk to me probably most easily there's a Skeptical Buddhist page on Facebook. and I post links to some of my answers on. It was actually Quora. That piece that you read earlier isn't on my blog. It's on Quora.com.
That's Quora? Quora. Quora.com.
Yeah, it's it's a plural of quorum.
Yeah. Okay.
It's people just answering questions.
And the Skeptical Buddhist page on Facebook.
On Facebook, yeah, or my blog, justalittledust.com/blog. It's an easy way to get.
A lot of good writing there. And the other thing is, I'll just put in another plug for your book, Dependent Arising in Context. If you buy the hard copy, something neat happens. You get a free Kindle copy too.
Right. So like you can give away the hard copy to a friend and just read the Kindle version yourself.
Which would increase the merit that you accrue through the act.
It increases the readership, and that's really the point. I've learned from my own practice, and a lot of people have told me that this is a really useful way of looking at dependent arising, and it's helpful in your life, and you see it and understand it more and more as time goes on, and it helps. And so for me, it's not about becoming a rich millionaire. I never will with that book. It's about getting the word out so that people can actually put it into practice and use it.
Yeah. No, I think it's very practical. So I want to thank you for your work, and thank you for your time today.
Well, thank you for having me on. It's been fun.
Great. Thanks, Linda. Take care.
Yeah.